as you may have seen, at least on the first iteration of the agenda for this conference, we noted that there were some cross-cutting themes of the conference around issues, including around technology cooperation, that we don't have a specific panel on that, but of course technology issues have arisen in many of the panels and thematic discussions that you've been part of. And so has investment, but we didn't have a panel on investment per se. So I was opportunistic and thought, let's have a lunchtime dive around these two issues, taking advantage of the fact that we have two really brilliant academics who've been working on these issues for a long time. So what we're going to do, we can sit down. I can sit down as well. So the topic of this lunchtime dive is on towards sustainable investment and technology models, partnerships and agreements in support of climate action. And so I've asked James Nedumpura, who is a professor and head of the Centre for Trade and Investment Law in India, as well as Thomas Cotier, who's Professor Emeritus of European and International Economic Law at the University of Bern. So I've asked each of them to offer around 7 minutes of remarks to spur a conversation on how we can think about rules, policies, and approaches to sustainable investment and technology in relation to sustainable trade and for pushing trade cooperation to support climate mitigation, but also adaptation and climate resilient development. So I'm going to stop speaking there. I'm going to first turn to James. I would just ask for anyone who's having a conversation to stop having the conversation so that we can be respectful and listen, and you can come forward and be part of this. We have some people who are also behind us who are taking advantage of chairs and tables. Maybe we should move ourselves back. Or you guys can hear us, can't you? So you could do a 360 kind of presentation. But I'll hand first to James, please. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Carolyn, and thank you, Tess, for inviting me to this very interesting conference. I found the discussions over the last 2 days extremely illuminating, and also nice to be with Professor Thomas Cotier, with whom I have also worked for a fairly long period, exchange views on a number of issues as well. So this particular discussion is actually the kind of, the movement towards sustainable investment, sustainable technologies, with a view to spurring sustainable international trade. And we know that low carbon and climate resilient technologies actually depend upon on how technology and investment are actually mobilized and governed. So as part of the Paris Agreement and as part of the internal efforts taken by many countries, we have set our own goals. So the goals are out there, but the most important thing is to find a practical solution with a view to aligning trade and innovation so that the goals can actually be achieved. And we have seen in recent times how technology innovations have actually led to reduced carbon footprint. One important example is basically in the renewable energy sector. And we know that, to start off with, initially we had the photovoltaic technology, the crystalline came along. Now we have got other new technologies which are much better. So technology is absolutely key to providing solutions to reducing the carbon footprint, and also with a view to reducing, the emissions. So it is very important for that matter. And the second important point is that we are now thinking about the new industries, the new age industries, and we know that the employment opportunities can actually be created in the new technologies or in the technologies of the future for that matter. Maybe the artificial intelligence, maybe the renewable energy sector itself. These are actually where the employment and investment can happen in the future as well. So now the important point here is that when we think about sustainability or sustainable trade, we always forget about the role of sustainable investment. And we know that sustainable investment has to actually happen first so that we have got sustainable trade. And when we really look at this concept from an international point of, from an international treaty point of view as well, this is actually written very clearly in the Paris Agreement. And the climate goals are actually dependent on making finance flows consistent with the pathways towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient technologies. So the one point is that I think this is one area some people said that we are actually on tracks, and some people believe that we do not have enough investment coming. But I'm actually looking at one OECD statistic which mentioned that in the year 2022 alone, the states have committed $115 billion in that particular year. But we know that countries, including India, actually want much higher investment. They want 1.3 trillion investment in climate-related sectors by 2030. So now, what are actually the options? The options are quite a number of them. The one is basically priority lending. So let me tell you, the action has to actually happen domestically. Most of the countries will have to think about ways and means of actually incentivizing investment in this sector. So priority lending is a very important way. Corporate social responsibility is another important factor. So let me actually give an Indian example. India introduced a change in the Income Tax Act, and countries above a particular size, countries making profit above a particular size, will have to actually make 2% contribution towards corporate social responsibility. The point is that if the companies can identify the correct technologies and the new industries, this fund can actually be used in a much better way. The other important point is basically trade finance. At the moment, trade finance is actually within the hands of the developing world. So you can say the future of sustainability also, to an extent, is in the hands of the developed countries. The second important point is actually net zero export credit assistance. And this point is often lost sight of. So that is again one important point. So now let me actually come to the technology transfer issues. We know that we can say let there be technology transfer. That won't happen. So technology transfer really require viable business propositions and business rationale for that matter. So what is actually seen in recent times is that if your domestic market is significantly large, then investment will definitely flow. Because most of the countries or most of the companies or firms would like to invest in a country where they can see a sizable market. So investment in a sustainable in technology will definitely happen in big market. But what about the small markets? So this is one area where I think some kind of an intervention is actually required. Multilateral lending institutions, development banks can actually play a very important role in this matter. The other important thing is basically, there are the various ways of attracting technology. Foreign direct investment itself is one of the most important forms of technology attraction. And we know that forced technology transfer will not work. It might have worked in certain countries, but that is not actually the way forward. So what can be done? So what we have to do is basically create innovation hubs. And innovation hubs are very important. The second important point is that sometimes some of the most important sustainable technologies have got an IPR related to it. Having seen the COVID experience, I'm not very enthusiastic about companies actually giving away or waiving their rights, intellectual property rights, in order to make their technologies out there in the public domain. So here, I think Professor Cotier has also mentioned on multiple occasions about Article 66.2 of the TRIPS agreement, which actually provides a mandatory obligation in order to transfer technologies to lead developing countries. That hasn't really worked. So now let me, I don't know whether I have the time, but I will actually talk about a couple of more points as well. The other important point is basically the green, the green economy agreements. So we are also talking about the new categories of partnerships and agreements, which can basically make this kind of technology transfer possible. So one agreement, which in the previous session, Emma actually mentioned about the Australia-Singapore economy agreement. That is not actually a purely cooperative agreement. There are market access elements or liberalization elements within that agreement, especially with respect to around 600 odd ESG, environmentally sustainable goods and services for that matter. The second important point is, we have seen the IPA supply chain pillar. So that is actually pillar 2, and there was another pillar, the clean economy pillar. The clean economy pillar was quite a novel concept. Of course, it only happened within the IPF region, I think 12 or 13 countries for that matter. But that mechanism had an IPF catalytic fund. And 4 countries, if I remember correctly, the United States, South Korea, then Australia, and one more country, actually committed around $33 million in 2023 alone. And it had a very ambitious, climate mitigation adaptation mechanism by creating a fund. But of course, in the recent times, with the new administration coming in the United States, I do not know the future of IPEF, the clean economy pillar. The next agreement which I would like to mention is the India-EFTA agreement. It's actually a free trade agreement. So obviously the point is that Switzerland doesn't have any industrial tariffs. India at that time had very high tariffs. So India said that if India has to enter into this agreement with the EFTA countries, there has to be something in return. And what is there? The investment can actually be the thing in return for reducing market access barriers and non-tariff barriers, both in goods and services. So Switzerland agreed for meeting certain kind of targets. One is actually meeting 100 billion in the 10 years and then escalating it further and also leading to 10 million jobs, employment creation. At the moment, how this particular agreement will be worked out remains to be seen. But my own feeling is that if it can be given a green kind of a color, then investment can actually be channelized in this particular location. So that is very important. And I would also like to mention that the free trade agreements also have got a major role to play. So I feel that in the context of WTO, the market access negotiations have almost become a thing of the past. It may not happen in the immediate future. But in free trade agreements, market access, both in goods and services, are actually being offered, and also in related areas like government procurement. So if a country has to actually provide market access commitments, or if it is providing market access commitments beyond a particular level, then it can be accompanied by technology transfer as well. So these are various ways. I think there is no limitation or shortage of ideas, but what I mentioned is some kind of tangible, I think, improvements made in this particular area. The future will be very interesting, and I think it requires a committed effort on part of all the countries to make sure that the climate goals can be achieved. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, James. And great to hear those really concrete examples of how you see that, where you see some of the kinds of opportunities and lessons. So let me turn straight now to you, Thomas. I can just give you my one if in doubt. That's easy.
Well, thank you very much, Caroline, for inviting me, and apologies for shortening your lunch break. I was thinking, what should I best say while you're standing after a sandwich? And I thought, moreover, in very depressing times where sustainability is basically falling down the ladder of priorities, fundings are being cut, and it's very difficult to implement programs and to negotiate on the issue. And my question is, given that period of time, what is the contribution academics and researcher can make? Of course, fact-finding is important, following what's going on is important, but in the long run, I would like to suggest to really stress working on fundamental principles in the long run. And one example I'd like to stress, following up on the pathway of sustainability, which emerged since the Brundtland report over many, many years until it was accepted in society, including the private sector, is a common concern of humankind. Climate change, biodiversity, etc., are recognized as common concerns of humankind. And I think it's a task of academics to flesh this out and actually to render it into a legal principle and get it recognized. So when you do your next edition here, it will be listed among the recognized principles of international law. I think common concern of humankind says that we are dealing with problems which cannot be solved in isolation. You can't do it on your own. Even a large company, a large country is not able to do it. And of course, the main example is climate change. So you have a foundation for cooperation, the duty to cooperate, which does not exist except for treaty law and international law. There is no general obligation to cooperate. You need to link it up to a principle. But more, I think beyond the duty to cooperate is a duty to act. And that is even more revolutionary because international law does not know a duty to act even in the field of jus cogens here. And then you have, of course, you can develop an obligation to do your homework, to make your contributions, and then you can link it up also with compliance issues, etc. We set this out in a book and papers, but there's very little response to that. People are not interested. This is just a principle. So to what avail? Now, I'll want to give you an example how this principle could be put to use. And I take the example of a technology transfer. We know this has been a burning issue ever since the code was negotiated to no avail in UNCTAD in the 60s here. What is the problem with technology transfer? I mean, we have very few binding obligations. You mentioned one is 66.2 in TRIPS. You also have them in Article 11 of the UNFCCC in the Paris Agreement, but it doesn't really work. Well, it works in the private sector where the money is available because intellectual property provides all you need for voluntary licensing, everything. That works fine. Most of it, which you see here in terms of solar panels and other things, are based on voluntary licensing arrangements, etc. But the shortcomings are often there is a lack of funding, and governments are not making these fundings available anymore. And moreover, compulsory licensing just does not work because you need access to the know-how, which is not subject to compulsory licensing, trade secrets. We've seen the shift in the negotiations on the World Health Organization pandemic agreement, where the philosophy, which came all the way for the last 20 years in the South about compulsory licensing, was changed to a cooperative approach. Hopefully it will work out, but it has its reason that compulsory licensing on the ground simply does not really work. Now, we face the problem that governments are not willing or able to put up the funds to support transfer of technology. You don't get these through parliaments anymore because they want to spend their money at home or on rearmament today, etc. So what other incentives can we provide? What other incentives could we provide under the principle of common concern of humankind to convince the private sector to invest in transfer of technology, investment abroad, and also to the government to agree without actually putting up subsidies and funding here? And this is my second plea to you. Please widen the horizon and turn into tax law. This is not something we normally deal with international economic law, except for non-discrimination issues. But tax law is the main tool to create incentives for the private sector, the main tool. So what we could think about is under the principle of common concern of humankind, so in the field of biodiversity, in the field of climate change, in other areas as well, which are covered and will be covered in the future, to basically move into a system of tax breaks. Tax breaks, tax reductions for companies who are engaging with other countries in this field. And we can work on the basis of existing rules, the so-called patent boxes. This was developed in the OECD. It was adopted by many, in particular European countries here. And with the rules today that if you sell goods abroad or you invest abroad and the return is based upon intellectual property rights, you are taxed much lower. The company is taxed much lower here. And this idea of patent boxes could be also used, in my view, in the field of climate change, mitigation, and adaptation here. And the beauty of it is you don't need to agree in the WTO. This is unilateral policy. Countries can go on with this, and they may be challenged at some point by somebody arguing, well, this is what you're doing is an export subsidy. You're prohibited from that. But I would then argue, well, yes, this is an export subsidy, but we suggest a waiver for this. Because everybody would agree to do that. Who would be opposed to that except for perhaps competitors? And then, based upon the waiver, we may have then grounds to renegotiate the ASEAN agreement, which we have to do anyway to adjust to the new times here. But so to summarize here, I think as academics, we should not simply, what what I think most people are doing, following what the politics and diplomacy are doing in international organization and comment on it, but actually to engage and ask, where can we make a genuine contribution on our own? Where can we make a difference? General principles are developed by academics. They are picked up by courts of law. They're not picked up by international organizations, diplomacy, who is very much focused on specific special interest here. And secondly, widen the debate by including new areas of the law, and widen the debate by including tax law in the debate on technology transfer here. That is also something academics need to do. This is not what a delegation will bring up in the WTO. This needs a long-term preparation. And so that's why I think we should really have a debate. What is the proper function of academic research in this difficult period on the principle of sustainability? But I'm confident in 10 years, maybe 5 years, it will be there. So good luck. Thank you very much.
Thank you so thank you so much, Thomas. Very inspiring. I've written down widen the horizon and the time frame and focus on the sort of unique contribution that research and analysis can make over that longer horizon. So really well said. I always say actually within TESS, our job is not to be journalists watching what the latest debate is this week and next week, but to try and look towards the future. And that's hard when you're also trying to be policy relevant. But I think, as you're very right, that at that sort of policy research interface, we need to provide people vision, and that can happen through strong, well-substantiated ideas and arguments of how different ways forward. So I just wanted to check if there are any questions or reflections from any of you. Trevor, you're going to be in trouble for talking during the panel. See, I'm like a strict mum here. Everyone has to be silent at the dinner table. So just to check if anyone has any questions or reflections. No questions at all. James, did you have any reflections on what Thomas said around his idea of the principle of common concern of humankind?
Yes. I think that is a very attractive principle, but in the case of corporate entities, I'm not absolutely sure whether in their business operation that principle will be finding a real place. So most of them are actually driven by profit motives. And to an extent, I think that is actually a new moment. The ESG moment is happening in multiple countries. So there is some kind of a pressure from within the industry to turn green, to actually give heed to sustainability practices. So that is where some of this kind of these kind of urges should be internalized. And what you completely understand the point, there is with the efforts of international community, with the effort of organizations like yours, there is a growing understanding and realization within the industry that we have to do it for the public common good. So another point which he mentioned about this the tax break. So I mean, my concern is not from the trade law point of view per se, but again, we know that most of the tax breaks given for a lot of these programs are actually being challenged, either maybe at the WTO, or sometimes they are also countervailed in various domestic jurisdiction, and that we have seen especially in the context of the solar cells and many renewable energy products as well. So the point is that many countries have got their own domestic industry to protect, and if subsidy breaks or tax breaks are actually given in other countries, it will become a very immediate candidate for countervailing duty actions, and that we have seen in recent times. So and he also mentioned about the idea of a kind of a waiver. So my own feeling is that the concept of waiver is actually a very good thing. Even in the context of carbon pricing, the best solution is actually to have a waiver for a certain period of time, so that the countries can pursue their climate objectives without any kind of impediment. But given the kind of politics and dynamics within this organization, getting a waiver is very difficult. And we have seen it in the context of the vaccines as well. The vaccine waiver was so difficult. I mean, so it happened only once in time, and that happened in the context of 2003, 2005, the TRIPS waiver. We don't have any other good examples of waiver in the WTO. So from a realistic point of view, I do not know. I mean, these are very good suggestions actually. It may become a reality, I hope so, but the evidence doesn't point to a very good success. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Any other reflections or questions for anyone? Yes, please, Umberto. Do you know Umberto is a professor of international law at the University of Sao Paulo?
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Coutier. It's nice to see you again. I really appreciated your reflections and your comments. I totally agree with you that climate change is one of the principles, international principles. My question to you is, though, concerning your suggestion on tax law, domestic tax law. We all know that the e-commerce agreement in the WTO has not advanced, mainly because of tax concerns. This is one of the reasons for this. But when you say that tax law would matter to advancing certain issues, don't you think that that might lead us to contest the multilateralism? The idea in itself of multilateralism, because you seem to propose something that it's upon the members to deal with this problem, so internally, domestically. But could we work out certain solution that would be more linked with the principles of multilateralism? That's my question. Thank you.
Actually, I think Rajan has a question as well. So we'll get two and then we'll probably, I don't see.
Thank you. I was just responding to Thomas's proposal about tax credits, and I know that Umberto is concerned about violations of the principles of multilateralism, and so is James. But I think the area of climate change, technology transfers to facilitate climate change actions, I think it's important enough for us to try to override our objections. I know that there will be some countervailing, but as Thomas said, the ASCM is in for a serious review anyway. We need to amend the ASCM to accommodate new global priorities like climate change, and maybe tax breaks could be a good intervention. The only question I had to Thomas was, I think what you suggested was tax breaks in the home country, but could it not be extended to the host country as well? It takes two to tango.
Please, I'll turn back to Thomas and James if either of you, but I think many of the questions there were for you.
First to James, about being skeptical about common concern of humankind being accepted. I just recall the history of sustainability, which started off as a fancy idea until it got accepted even in the private sector. First, basically as a selling point, but then becoming very serious when they faced lawsuits and unfair competition if they didn't comply. So it's a long, this is a perception thing. So I think the same can happen with common concern, just to create the foundation for this kind of action we were contemplating in the tax field. Now, in the tax field, we have many, many examples where countries use tax breaks for exports to promote their own competitiveness. And there's hardly any challenge in the WTO on this here. Mainly in Asian countries, India also, South Korea, Japan had these kind of export subsidies, but they were not challenged. And yes, these are, first you start off with unilateral policies. This is always the game. Somebody starts off with unilateral policies, and then if others don't like it, they start complaining, and then maybe there's dispute settlement, and then maybe they engage into a negotiation, a multilateral negotiation on these kind of things. This is how it happens. It's always reactive in the history, and that essentially would be the same thing. But I believe that that, as it was said, that if combating climate change and helping to adapt to it in the field of agriculture, where you really need very close cooperation in developing new seeds, etc., that there should be, I'm quite confident that a consensus could be built that this kind of measures to the benefit of the developing countries, not to everybody, but to the developing of those countries in need, could be agreeable in the community.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm going to wrap up in just a minute, but Rachel, you had a question as well?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much. Two questions. One for James. You mentioned foreign direct investment, and one thing that always, apologies to those that were in my panel or that were in my group before. This is a similar question. When we think about the use of foreign direct investment in terms of transfer of technology, encouraging access to technology, I always worry about the risk to those countries where foreign investors are operating there, and then they have restrictions on what kinds of regulations they can put in place. So sort of the investor state dispute risk for some countries that have a lot of those agreements. Can you think of ways to sort of mitigate that risk where you do in fact need foreign direct investment, if you have thoughts on that? And then for Thomas, you mentioned compulsory licensing doesn't work. And I just want to push a little bit on that, since it has worked in certain sectors, in certain contexts. And I wonder if you can think about sort of other ways that maybe on an industry level, we might see intellectual property rules be leveraged for access. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great questions, Rachel. So I'm just going to say we're going to close because you've all been standing a long time. It's supposed to be lunch break and you all need a coffee. So we're just going to wrap up in the next sort of 4 or 5 minutes. Over to you, please, James. Yeah.
So thank you. I think I just made the point that investment is actually the best form of getting a technology. But at the same time, what is happening in the world is that when it comes to a really good technology, even in the field of maybe renewable energy, critical energy, many countries actually come up with barriers. So the first barrier is not actually the importing country, but in the exporting country itself. Most of the countries which may have these proprietary technologies wouldn't like the technologies to be even licensed. So I'm not talking about the obligations of the host country in the first place. Even the exporting country will have to actually make sure that it can free up the restrictions and the technologies can come to the other country. The one idea which I would like to mention here is that in some of the recent agreements, especially the European Union agreements, basically dealing with investment liberalization, that deals with services and manufacturing. There is a mechanism to expedite investment proposals which have got the ultimate objective of spurring technology in sustainable sectors. So if you're coming up with a technology in a new area, then the host country can come up with an expedited, a fast track mechanism in order to provide the domestic clearances and authorizations. So that is actually one way of dealing with this particular problem. And the second idea, one point which I want to mention here, just a comment, small comment. So Professor Koti was talking about the domestic taxation as a kind of an incentive. So it is actually a kind of a revenue forgone, which is nothing but a financial contribution and therefore can be a subsidy. But the one suggestion here is that many countries actually provide, what you call as cess. So it is not generally a tax collection. It is a tax collection with a purpose. So you collect the certain kind of taxes and you only use that collected taxes for a identified purpose. And in India, we have got mechanisms like that. So if you come up with innovative mechanisms, you will actually get the funding which is required for the new technologies. So just a couple of suggestions.
Well, just on compulsory licensing, which is really well set out in the TRIPS agreement, if you look at the practice, for example, in the context of medicines and the Doha Declaration, it was just the whole system was just used once, basically. The main purpose of compulsory licensing is to give governments a leverage to negotiate. And that's just threat. That's a stick, and you use it to bring down the pricing. And we can see this in AIDS medication, where the prices were brought down very, very, very well. So, but in the field of climate change, adaptation and mitigation, you often really depend on cooperation, knowledge transfer, and you can't enforce that, basically. Some people talk about it, how we can introduce compulsory licensing for trade secrets. How would you do that? They think, well, we'll just put heavy fines on it, like we know in competition law. But I think that's not a very productive approach here. So I think we have to basically support the private sector in engaging into these kind of activities, and tax breaks. I said is one way. Of course, one could also think on the the host state here, but the host state often has the problem of lacking funds, and maybe there are other ways to support by reducing tariffs, etc., which still are often quite high on these goods here, and other ways to support it. But I think it's one way of implementing also the principle of shared but differentiated responsibility, that the financial burden should really be rather on the exporting side here. And it's not a east-west issue. I think it would also apply to China, who is exporting a lot of technology today, in other countries as well in their fields here.
Thank you. Thank you very much to Thomas and to James for really insightful remarks and for the questions. Also, it strikes me that at the beginning I wanted the panel to focus on sustainable investment. Then we sort of added in technology, and in fact, it's perfect because there's so many interlinkages between these two issues. And I think in a subsequent iteration of this conference, it might be worth having a dive both into each again, but together, and being able to have a longer discussion on this topic. But thank you so much. And you have many behind you also listening in case you haven't seen them. And thank you again, and thank you all for listening. And just a reminder while I have the microphone, that we'll meet again at 2:30 in either of the two thematic sessions that you're joining. Both of which are on really critical topics on fossil fuels and the clean energy transition, and the other on trade, debt, climate, and finance, where some of these issues will arise again. And then just a reminder, we have the final panel at the end of the day. We have the ambassadors of Brazil, Barbados, and the European Union coming. So really an opportunity to have a conversation with them also about what they see the prospects for progress on these issues in the multilateral setting. So if you can stay, please do stay for that last session. I know it's the end of a long conference, but thank you again very much for taking the time. And thank you.